The sun was sinking low across the wide prairie, washing the land in shades of copper and gold. Dust rose with each whisper of wind, carrying the scent of sage and dry earth. Out beyond the mesquite trees, a lonely ranch stood, its timbers worn from years of weather and work. Life was never easy in the borderlands, and folks who lived there were hardened by it. A man who worked the soil and tended cattle learned quick that trust was scarce, and survival often depended on the choices made when a stranger came knocking. That evening, with night pressing close, the rancher stood on his porch, his boots planted firm and his rifle resting near the door. He was a man of habit, silent and steady, with eyes that had seen too much to be easily startled. Still, what he saw coming across the barren ground made his hand tense. Two young women moved toward the ranch, their steps weary, their faces marked by dust and the weight of long miles. Their clothing carried the cut of their people, the Apache, and their presence alone could stir unease. Tales had spread across the settlements, stories of raids, of lives taken in the night, of cattle driven off by warriors who vanished like smoke into the hills. Fear made many settlers hard and bitter, ready to shut their doors at the mere sight of anyone bearing Apache blood. Yet here were two sisters, not with weapons in their hands, but exhaustion in their bodies and a quiet plea in their eyes. The older one carried herself with a calm strength, her dark hair braided back, her gaze steady even as the rancher's suspicion weighed heavy. The younger clutched a small bundle at her chest, her steps uncertain, but her face holding a kind of desperate hope. They did not come as raiders or enemies. They came as travelers in need, with hunger in their stomachs and the chill of the desert night closing in. The rancher had lived too long in these lands not to understand the risk. Offering shelter to Apache meant inviting whispers from neighbors, maybe even trouble from men who saw things in simple lines of friend and foe. But he also knew the land was cruel, and leaving anyone out under the wide, cold stars could mean death. His heart was not blind, though it was guarded, and as the sisters drew closer, he found himself torn between caution and something else he could not yet name. The silence of the prairie deepened as they reached the porch. The older sister spoke first, her voice quiet but firm. She asked for shelter, only for the night, a place to rest where the coyotes would not circle and the cold would not claim them. The words were plain, carrying no demand, only need. The younger remained still beside her, her eyes watching the rancher with a mix of fear and trust, as though the world had left her with little choice but to place her fate in the hands of a stranger. For a moment, the man said nothing. His mind turned with the weight of his own loneliness, of nights spent listening to the wind scrape the walls, of meals eaten in silence, of years lived without the warmth of voices beside the fire. The land had made him strong, but it had also made him hollow, and now, before him, stood a test of what remained in him beyond survival. The sisters waited, their breath showing faint in the cooling air. The rancher finally spoke, his tone measured, his words heavy. He said they could stay, but only under a condition that made the air around them shift with tension. His voice carried not cruelty, but a sternness that revealed both the burden of his solitude and the sharp edge of mistrust. The desert was not a place for soft bargains. The older sister held his gaze, her chin lifting slightly. She understood the weight behind his words, though she did not answer right away. The younger one's hands tightened around her bundle, her breath caught in her throat. The moment stretched long, as though the land itself waited to see what choice would be made. Inside the house, the fire cracked, its light spilling warm against the windows, a sharp contrast to the chill of night. The sisters stood at the threshold of more than just a shelter. What hung in the air was not simply the question of whether they would sleep under a roof, but whether they would step into a bargain that might bind them in ways they could not yet see. The rancher's hand rested on the doorframe, his eyes never leaving theirs. He was a man shaped by hardship, and he offered them something rare in a land that gave little mercy. But his condition was clear, and it pressed on them like the weight of the desert sky. The older sister drew in a breath, steadying herself. She looked at the younger, then back at the man before them. Words rose in her chest, words that could alter the course of their fate. Yet before they could be spoken, the wind picked up, rattling the dry branches near the barn and carrying with it the howl of a coyote. It was as though the night itself wanted to remind them that every choice carried consequence, and some doors, once stepped through, could never be closed again. And so the porch held its silence, the rancher waiting, the sisters caught in the stillness between need and uncertainty. The fire flickered in the cabin behind him, casting its glow like a promise or a warning, while the land around them grew darker with each passing breath. What answer would be given, and what it would set in motion, remained hanging in the desert air, unresolved. Like a storm waiting to break doth the silence stretched on the porch, the night pressing closer with every passing moment. The rancher's words hung heavy in the air, a challenge and a condition, his gaze steady and unflinching. The older sister did not move, though her heart beat fast beneath the calm she showed on her face. The younger one shifted slightly, clutching her bundle tighter as though holding on to the only piece of safety she still carried in this world. Neither of them spoke, yet their silence was not weakness. It was the weight of deciding whether to step into something unknown, something that could change the course of their lives. The rancher had lived long enough to know that hesitation often revealed more than words. In that pause, he studied them closely. He saw the way the older sister squared her shoulders, how her eyes did not waver even though the shadows deepened around them. He saw the way the younger sister's lips trembled before she pressed them firm, her gaze darting once toward the open desert behind them as if measuring whether she could run back into its emptiness. He wondered what roads had brought them here, what dangers had pushed them to knock on his door rather than seek shelter among their own. Inside his chest, something stirred that he did not often allow himself to feel. Loneliness, yes, but also a memory of times when people had looked to him for help, when he had chosen to turn away to protect himself. Out here, kindness could cost a man everything. Yet there was something about the way these two stood before him, not begging, not demanding, simply standing with dignity, asking for a chance to rest. It unsettled him. The land itself had a way of testing those who walked upon it. The rancher had seen men break under its endless sky, and women wither when their hope ran dry. He knew well how the borderlands could turn neighbor against neighbor, how suspicion ran deeper than rivers. And now, on his porch, stood two Apache sisters' reminders of every fear and every tale told around firelit gatherings. He thought of the settlers nearby, men who carried rifles on their shoulders and bitterness in their hearts. If they saw what he saw now, they would not ask questions. They would only act. The older sister finally broke the silence. Her words came low and steady, shaped with the weight of pride but softened by the need that could not be hidden. She spoke of their journey, though not in detail. She said they had walked far, that their people were scattered, that the land had given them little in return for their struggle. Her voice carried neither shame nor pleading, but a simple truth. They needed a place to stay, even if only until morning. The rancher listened, his jaw tight. Her words did not answer every question that pressed in his mind. Where were the rest of their kin? Why had they come to his ranch instead of another? What danger followed them across the desert? He knew she was holding more than she spoke, but he also knew this was no time to press. The younger sister's eyes lifted for a moment, just enough to meet his. He caught a flicker there, a mix of fear and trust, and it unsettled him more than the older sister's calmness. It reminded him of innocence trying to survive in a world that gave no room for it. Behind them, the coyotes called again, their voices carrying sharp across the open land. The sisters turned their heads slightly at the sound, their bodies instinctively tense, as if reminding him they were hunted by more than just the cold. He thought of the tracks he had noticed earlier that day near the creek, bed hoof prints and ashes that did not belong to him. Trouble was not far, and whether it was men or hunger or something else, he could not yet tell. Still, he kept his face unreadable. He stepped back toward the door, letting the glow of the fire spill wider across the porch. The sisters did not move forward at once. They seemed to sense that stepping across that threshold would not simply mean a night's shelter. It would mean accepting the condition he had set, stepping into a bond they did not fully understand. The older one's hand brushed lightly against the younger's arm, a small gesture of comfort, though her own heart carried its own storm. The rancher spoke again, his voice carrying the grit of a man who had lived through battles of his own. He said the desert was not kind, and a man did not survive it by offering charity to every passerby. He said if they stayed, it would not be as simple as resting under his roof. His words did not carry cruelty, but the hardness of someone who knew that survival often demanded a price. The older sister lifted her chin, her eyes never leaving his. She did not speak in return this time, though her silence spoke plenty. She was weighing him just as he weighed her. In her mind, she thought of the dangers behind them, the paths they had walked to reach this place, and the truth that no other doors would open to them. She knew the stories settlers told of her people. She knew they were seen as shadows and threats, even when all they carried was need. The younger one shifted again, the bundle in her arms stirring slightly as if it carried more than cloth. Her eyes darted to the firelight inside the house, then back to the older sister. The rancher noticed the movement, though he said nothing. Curiosity flickered through him, but he did not ask. Not yet. The night deepened, and the prairie winds grew colder. The rancher's decision had already been spoken, but its weight still lingered, waiting for the sisters to answer with action. For now, the tension held them all in place, none willing to break it. The land seemed to lean closer, the silence between them carrying the promise of whatever was to come. Far in the distance, a faint glow shimmered on the horizon, not from stars or moon, but from fire. The sisters noticed it before the rancher did, their eyes sharpening at once, their bodies stiffening. He turned and caught sight of it, an orange glimmer rising beyond the dark hills. It was not close enough to threaten yet, but close enough to warn. Someone else was moving across the land, someone carrying flame into the night. The older sister's jaw tightened, though she did not speak. The rancher studied her face, and in that moment he knew she understood more about that fire than she would tell him. He felt the weight of choice pressing down harder. His house, his land, his very life could be tied to whatever storm followed these women. And still, here they stood, waiting at his door. The younger one whispered something soft in her own tongue, almost like a prayer, and her voice trembled as she spoke. The older placed a hand on her shoulder, steadying her. The rancher did not understand the words, but he felt their weight all the same. It was a reminder that these two carried a story much larger than what they had shared, and stepping into it would not leave him unchanged. The fire on the horizon flickered again, growing faint as the wind shifted, but its warning remained. The desert was never still for long. The rancher looked once more at the sisters, their figures framed against the endless night. He did not lower his gaze, nor did they. Between them stretched a silence heavy with unspoken truths, the kind that could shape destinies. And there, on that porch, with the night deep around them and danger burning somewhere out in the dark, the choice remained unresolved. Would the sisters step inside and bind themselves to the conditions set before them, or turn back to face whatever waited in the desert's shadows? The answer lingered in the air, heavy and uncertain. As the wind rattled the dry boards beneath their feet, the night grew heavier, the desert air colder, and still the sisters lingered on the porch as if caught between two worlds. The rancher stood in the doorway, his frame blocking the warm glow of the fire behind him. The wind pressed against the house with a low whistle, carrying with it the dry smell of mesquite and distant smoke. None of them spoke for several moments, yet silence itself seemed to weigh more than words could. At last, the older sister stepped forward, her boots brushing against the rough boards of the porch. The younger one followed a half-step behind, clutching her bundle close, her eyes darting from the man to the door. With that movement, the decision was made. The threshold was crossed. But the tension did not ease. If anything, it settled deeper, like the hush before a storm. Inside, the cabin was simple yet sturdy, the mark of a man who built to endure. A table of rough wood sat near the hearth, a rifle leaned against the wall, and tools lined neatly along a shelf. The fire cracked steadily, throwing long shadows across the room. The sisters stepped in, their dark eyes adjusting quickly to the dim light. For a moment, the warmth touched their faces, though it did not soften the unease in their stance. The rancher shut the door, the sound of the latch echoing through the small room. He turned back to them, his expression unreadable. The older sister met his gaze, her chin lifted. The younger one lowered her eyes, shifting her weight from one foot to the other. The rancher gestured toward the table, a silent invitation to sit. They hesitated before taking their places, the bundle resting on the younger's lap, wrapped carefully as though it were more precious than anything else in the world. He moved about the cabin with the steady rhythm of someone who knew every corner by heart. A kettle was set on the stove, a pan pulled from the shelf. He spoke little, though his presence filled the room with a quiet authority. The older sister watched him closely, measuring every movement. She could see the kind of man he was, not quick to speak, but firm once he did. When the kettle began to hiss, he poured hot water into tin cups and placed them on the table. Steam rose between them, curling in the air. The sisters wrapped their fingers around the cups, grateful for the warmth. The younger sipped quickly, her lips pressing against the metal with eagerness. The older took slower sips, her eyes never leaving the man. He finally broke the silence. He asked where they had come from. His tone was not soft, but neither was it sharp. It carried the weight of someone who wanted to know the truth, but expected only half of it. The older sister replied carefully. She spoke of distant hills, of a camp no longer safe, of people scattered and gone. She did not offer details, and the rancher did not press. He knew there were parts of their story locked away, parts that might never be told to him. The younger sister shifted, as if wanting to add something, but the older placed a hand over hers, silencing her gently. The rancher noticed. That small act told him more than words could. Whatever had driven them here was not only hardship, it was danger, real and close. Outside, the coyotes cried again, their calls sharp against the wind. The younger flinched slightly, her hand tightening around her bundle. The rancher's eyes flicked toward it, curiosity stirring once more. What was it they carried with such care? He leaned back in his chair, saying nothing, but in his mind the question burned brighter. The older sister seemed to sense his unspoken thoughts. She shifted the bundle closer to her younger kin, her body drawing a line he would not cross without her consent. It was then he understood whatever lay wrapped in that cloth was not only precious, it was guarded with a kind of fierce devotion. And he wondered what it might mean for him, should trouble come knocking. As the firelight flickered across their faces, the tension in the room grew into something layered. On one side, the rancher's condition still hung unfulfilled, unspoken yet heavy. On the other, the mystery of their journey deepened with each glance, each half-answered question. And beyond all of it, the desert outside whispered of dangers moving closer, carried in the glow of distant firelight and the echo of hoofbeats he thought he had heard earlier in the day. The rancher leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table. He spoke of the land, of the neighbors who did not look kindly upon outsiders, especially Apache. He told them that if they stayed, even for one night, there could be consequences beyond these walls. Men might come asking questions. Some might come without asking at all. His words were not meant as threat, but warning. The sisters listened, their faces still but their eyes alive with thought. The older one finally replied, her voice steady. She said they understood the risk, but they had no choice. Her words carried no plea, only truth. The younger looked down, her hand brushing over the bundle as though soothing it. The rancher studied her, noting the way her lips pressed together, the way her shoulders trembled ever so slightly. She was young, too young to carry such fear. It struck something in him, something that stirred beneath the layers of hardness the land had built into him. But he kept his expression firm, his voice steady as he asked again if they understood the weight of his condition. The older sister met his gaze head on. Her silence stretched long, and though she did not answer, her eyes spoke of defiance and resilience, of someone who would not be bent easily. Still, he sensed something beneath that strength, weariness, perhaps even sorrow. She carried herself like one who had been forced to lead, to protect, when she longed for a life free of such burdens. The younger one glanced up at him then, her eyes wide, searching. In them he saw innocence struggling against the hardness of the world, and it unsettled him. He leaned back again, the chair creaking under his weight, and allowed the silence to stretch. Outside, the night deepened further. The fire on the horizon had dimmed, but smoke still lingered faint against the sky. The rancher knew men were out there, and he wondered if their path would lead here. He thought of the hoof prints by the creek, the ashes not his own, and unease settled into his bones. Trouble was moving across the land, and these sisters might be its shadow or its prey. Inside, the fire crackled, warm yet fragile against the vast cold pressing in from every side. The three of them sat in its glow, bound together by chance and choice, each carrying secrets unspoken. The rancher's condition still hung between them. The sisters' mystery deepened with every heartbeat, and the desert beyond whispered of threats not far away. The kettle hissed again, the only sound breaking the quiet. The younger sister shifted her bundle, the cloth slipping just enough to reveal a glimpse of what lay inside. The rancher's eyes caught at a small hand, fragile and still. His breath caught, though he did not speak. The older sister noticed his gaze at once, pulling the cloth tighter, her body bristling with protective instinct. The room fell into sharper silence, heavier than before. The rancher sat back slowly, his eyes narrowing not with anger but with understanding. A child. That was what they carried, hidden and shielded from the world. It explained their fear, their desperation, and the fire in the older sister's eyes when she spoke of needing shelter. Yet it also raised new questions. Whose child was it? Why were they fleeing with it across a land that gave no mercy? And more than that, what dangers hunted them because of it? The rancher's thoughts churned, but he spoke none of them aloud. Instead, he kept his gaze steady, his voice low. He told them that whatever they carried would bring more danger than the desert already promised. He told them that secrets could not be hidden forever, not in a land where every shadow was watched. The older sister's eyes hardened, her hand gripping the cloth tighter. She said nothing, but her silence carried a warning of its own. The younger one looked down at the bundle, her lips trembling as though she might cry, though she held it back. The fire cracked louder, a log breaking in half. The sound echoed through the cabin, sharp and final. Outside, the coyotes called again, their voices sharper now, joined by the faint sound of something else, hoofbeats in the distance, faint but steady. The rancher's head turned slightly, his ear catching the rhythm. He knew it well. Riders. More than one. Moving across the land toward them. Inside, the sisters grew still, their faces pale in the firelight. The bundle in the younger's arm shifted slightly, a soft whimper rising before it was hushed. The older sister's eyes shot to the door, then back to the rancher, her body taut with urgency. The rancher rose slowly, his chair scraping against the floorboards. He crossed the room to the rifle leaning against the wall, his hand wrapping around it with the ease of long habit. He did not speak, but the look in his eyes told the sisters all they needed to know. The night was no longer safe. The hoofbeats grew closer, steady and unrelenting, a rhythm that carried both promise and threat. The desert had delivered its warning. Whatever had driven the sisters here was not far behind, and now it was coming to his door. The hoofbeats grew louder, echoing across the hard earth like the steady pounding of a war drum. Each strike of iron against stone carried closer, sending a shiver through the night air. The rancher stood firm near the door, his rifle gripped steady in his hands, his eyes narrowing as he listened. He had lived long enough on this land to know the difference between riders passing by and riders with a purpose. These men were not drifting travelers. They were coming for something, or someone. The older sister straightened, her hand brushing against the younger's shoulder as though bracing her for what was to come. The younger clutched the bundle tighter, her breath sharp and shallow. The faint whimper inside the cloth was hushed quickly, though it hung in the silence like a secret too fragile to bear. The rancher's gaze flicked to it for only a moment before returning to the door. Every sound outside told him the riders were closing in, and with them came questions, danger, and choices that could not be avoided. The fire inside the cabin popped, throwing sparks against the stone hearth. Its glow warmed the small room, but it did nothing to soften the sharpness of the air pressing in from the outside. The older sister's eyes locked on the rancher's rifle, her body tense, ready to fight or flee if it came to that. He noticed, but he did not move to reassure her. This was no time for soft words. The hoofbeats slowed as they drew near, shifting into the steady crunch of men dismounting. Leather creaked, metal rattled. The rancher's heart tightened in his chest, not from fear, but from the heavy knowledge of what might come. Through the thin walls he heard voices low and rough, speaking in the tones of men who had seen too much dust and too little kindness. He caught a word or two: Apache, shelter, search. His jaw set harder. They were looking, and it was no mystery who they sought. The older sister's breath caught, though she remained outwardly still. She had expected this. The younger one's eyes widened, her body leaning closer to her sister, the bundle clutched as if it were her very life. The rancher moved to the window, careful not to let his shadow fall across it, and peered through the small slit between the boards. Outside, 3 men stood near their horses, rifles slung across their shoulders. Their faces were hard, drawn sharp by the firelight of a torch one of them carried. Settlers, neighbors perhaps. Men who had lived too long in fear and turned that fear into hatred. The rancher turned back, his face grim. He did not speak right away, but his silence told the sisters what they needed to know. The younger one's hands trembled, and for a moment the bundle stirred again, a faint sound rising before she hushed it against her chest. The rancher's eyes flicked to it, then to the older sister. There was no time left for secrets. Whatever was hidden in that cloth would soon be known, one way or another. The men outside called out, their voices sharp against the night. They demanded to know if the rancher had seen anything, if he had given shelter to strangers. Their tone carried no patience, only suspicion sharpened into anger. The rancher's hand tightened on his rifle. He had seen these kinds of men before, men who believed themselves keepers of order, but who carried only vengeance in their hearts. The sisters looked at him then, both of them, their eyes heavy with unspoken questions. Would he open the door and betray them, or stand against the very men who shared his world? The older one's gaze was steady, her strength shining through even in the fear of the moment. The younger's was different, pleading, raw, full of trust she did not know if she should give. The voices outside grew sharper, more insistent. The sound of boots on the porch made the wood creak. A fist pounded against the door, rattling it in its frame. The rancher did not move. His breath came slow, steady, as he stared at the wood that now separated the 3 inside from the men beyond. His life had taught him the price of every choice. This one would be no different. The older sister whispered low in her own tongue, words meant only for the younger. The younger nodded, though her eyes shimmered with fear. The rancher caught the tone if not the meaning, and it struck him that they were preparing themselves for what might come, even if it meant violence. He thought again of the child hidden in the bundle, the small hand he had glimpsed, the life they were trying to protect. It added weight to his shoulders, heavier than the rifle he carried. Outside, the men threatened to break the door down if it was not opened. Their boots scraped against the porch, their rifles shifting in their hands. The rancher glanced once at the sisters, then at the latch. His heart beat steady, though the air felt tight. He had been alone for years, his world built of silence and solitude. Now, in a single night, he found himself standing between two sisters and a group of men ready to kill for the sake of their fears. The older sister rose, her movements quiet but filled with resolve. She placed a hand on the younger's arm, steadying her, then turned her eyes back to the rancher. She did not speak, but her gaze carried the question that could not be avoided. Would he protect them or cast them out into the night? The pounding grew louder, shaking the door in its frame. One of the men shouted that he had seen tracks leading toward the ranch. He swore he would tear the place apart if need be. Their words burned with certainty, the kind of certainty that left no room for mercy. The rancher moved closer to the door, his rifle in hand. His voice, when he spoke, was calm, steady, carrying the weight of someone who had faced danger before. He called back to them, demanding to know their purpose, though he already knew. His words bought time, if only a breath more. The older sister's heart pounded, though she kept her face still. The younger clutched the bundle tighter, her body trembling. The child stirred again, a faint sound rising against the silence. The rancher heard it, and so did the older sister. Her eyes met his, fierce and pleading all at once. She knew if the men outside heard it too, all would be lost. The voices outside grew sharper, their suspicion turning into anger. One of them struck the door with the butt of his rifle, the wood groaning under the force. Another cursed, calling for the rancher to open up before they took matters into their own hands. Inside the cabin, time seemed to hold its breath. The rancher's finger brushed against the trigger of his rifle, his jaw tight, his mind caught between survival and something deeper. The sisters stood close, the older bracing for what was to come, the younger clutching life itself in her arms. Outside, the men gathered closer, their shadows stretching long against the porch. The torchlight flickered, painting their faces with the hard lines of hatred and determination. The desert night pressed in heavier, the coyotes' cries silenced now, as if even they waited for the clash about to break. The rancher's breath came slow, steady. He knew once the door opened, there would be no turning back. Choices made tonight would shape everything that followed. And with each pounding strike against the wood, the moment drew nearer. The line between peace and violence stretched to its breaking point. The younger sister whispered something again, her words trembling, her eyes shining with fear and trust. The older one squeezed her shoulder, her face set firm. The rancher turned slightly toward them, his rifle still ready, and for the first time since they had arrived, his eyes softened just enough to reveal the weight he carried. Another crash shook the door, louder than before. The men outside shouted, their patience gone, their anger spilling over. The wood cracked faintly under the force. Inside, the fire crackled louder, as if echoing the storm about to break. The rancher steadied himself, his body braced, his mind sharp. The sisters stood close together, the child hidden between them. And in that tense moment, with the desert night pressing close and danger hammering at the door, everything hung in balance, the next breath leading straight into the storm of the climax yet to come. Do you want the final climax section to bring all three rancher, sisters, and the riders into direct confrontation inside the cabin, or build it with the tension breaking outside first? The pounding at the door grew so fierce the frame shook with each blow. The rancher steadied himself, his rifle tight in his hands, his eyes locked on the wood that separated them from the men outside. The sister stood close behind him, the older one calm in her stillness, the younger clutching the bundle so tight her knuckles turned white. The faint sound of the child stirred again, muffled but clear enough that all three inside froze. If the men outside heard it, there would be no denying what lay within these walls. The rancher's voice cut through the noise, firm and sharp. He called out, warning the men to hold back, telling them his land was not theirs to storm. For a moment there was silence, then a rough laugh answered him, followed by words that carried the sting of mistrust. They claimed he was harboring Apache, that he was betraying his own kind. They swore they would not leave until they had searched every corner of the house. The rancher's jaw tightened, his heart steady even as the moment pressed harder. He had lived his life by lines drawn in the sand. Trust no one. Keep to yourself. Survive. Yet standing between these sisters and the men outside, he felt the weight of a choice far greater than survival. He thought of the small hand he had glimpsed in the bundle, the life so fragile and pure. He thought of the fear in the younger sister's eyes, the quiet strength in the older's, and in that moment he knew he could not step aside. The door rattled again, splintering slightly at the frame. The rancher raised his rifle, his voice booming louder now, carrying a warning so sharp it cut the night. He told the men that if they forced their way in, they would not leave unscathed. His tone left no doubt that he meant every word. The porch went silent. The men outside muttered among themselves, their voices low, their confidence shaken by the steel in his warning. Then one of them cursed, spitting words about Apache lies and ranchers gone soft. Boots shuffled on the boards, rifles clinked, and for a breath the night held its balance on the edge of violence. The sisters waited, their bodies stiff, their eyes fixed on the door. The rancher stood like a wall between them and the world outside, his rifle steady, his breath controlled. Finally, the sound of retreat came, boots thudding against the porch as the men stepped back. Horses snorted, reins jingled. One last threat was hurled at the door, promising they would return with more men, more fire, more fury. Then the hoofbeats rose again, fading slowly into the desert night. When the sound finally vanished, the cabin fell into stillness, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the faint whimper of the child. The rancher lowered his rifle, the weight of the moment pressing heavy on his shoulders. He turned to face the sisters. The older one's eyes burned with gratitude. She did not speak aloud, her pride too strong for simple thanks. The younger's eyes brimmed with tears, relief and fear mingling as she rocked the bundle gently. The rancher set his rifle aside and moved closer to the table, sinking into his chair with a sigh that carried the weariness of years. The older sister remained standing, her hand steady on the younger's shoulder, her posture still tense, as though she expected danger to return any moment. The younger finally loosened the cloth around the bundle, revealing the small face of the child within. A boy, no more than a year old, his dark eyes wide and curious despite the chaos that had surrounded him. The rancher's gaze softened as he looked upon the child. He understood now the reason for their journey, the weight they carried, the danger that followed them. The child was not simply a life to protect. He was a symbol of hope, a future, of survival for a people who had been pushed to the edge of the world. The older sister spoke then, her voice steady but low. She told him the child's parents were gone, lost in the violence that had scattered their people. She and her sister had taken him, swearing to keep him safe no matter the cost. They had traveled far, hiding from both enemies and so-called neighbors who would see the child as nothing but a threat. The rancher listened, his face unreadable, but in his heart he felt the truth of every word. He thought of the men outside, of their anger, their suspicion. He knew they would return, and when they did, it would not be with just 3 riders. They would bring more, and they would not leave until they had found what they sought. By taking these sisters and their child under his roof, he had crossed a line from which there was no return. But as he looked at them now, he found no regret. The older sister's eyes softened for the first time since she had arrived. She told him that he had done what few others would, that he had chosen to see them as people rather than shadows. The younger clutched the child close, whispering words of comfort in their tongue, rocking him gently as he drifted back into sleep. The rancher leaned back in his chair, staring into the fire. He knew what lay ahead would not be easy. There would be whispers, accusations, perhaps even blood. But there was also something else, something he had not felt in years. A sense of belonging, of purpose beyond the walls of his lonely ranch. For too long he had lived only for survival, but now he found himself tied to something greater. The night stretched long, but it was no longer silent. The sisters and the rancher shared the small cabin with the sound of breathing, the warmth of fire, the quiet presence of the child. Each carried scars, each carried burdens, but together they had faced the storm and held their ground. When dawn finally came, painting the desert in soft light, the world outside seemed quieter, though the danger had not vanished. The hoofprints on the dirt road remained, a reminder of the men who would surely return. The rancher stood on his porch, rifle at his side, watching the horizon. The older sister joined him, her eyes scanning the land with the same sharpness. For the first time, they stood not as strangers divided by fear, but as allies bound by a shared fight. The younger sister stepped outside too, the child in her arms, his small hand clutching at her braid. The rancher looked at them and felt the weight of a choice he had already made, though it had no words. He would stand with them, no matter what came. The desert stretched endless before them, harsh and unforgiving, but also filled with the quiet promise of survival. The rancher knew the land would test them again and again. Yet as the sun rose higher, he felt a strength he had not known in years. Not just his own, but theirs together. The sisters had come to his door asking for shelter, and in giving it, he had found something he had long forgotten, what it meant to fight for more than himself. The conflicts that had chased them still lingered in the distance, but in the quiet of the morning there was also hope. And for now, that was enough. The rancher stepped down from the porch, his boots sinking into the dust. The sisters followed, the child resting quietly between them. The land stretched wide and unforgiving, but so did the bond that now tied them. Whatever storms waited ahead, they would face them not as strangers, but as something stronger. In a world divided by mistrust and fear, they had chosen instead to belong not to the land, not to the neighbors, but to each other. And with that, the story of one man's loneliness and two sisters' desperate journey found its place under the vast desert sky, where hardship was certain, but hope was carried in the small, steady heartbeat of a child who represented tomorrow. Would you like me to also craft a shorter, more poetic closing passage, something you could use as a spoken outro for a YouTube narration?